Happy Wednesday, my friends. We're back again with a live stream. Mary Rose Wood here. I'm so pleased to be live on this Wednesday at 1 p.m. Pacific time, which is my customary habit on Wednesdays, unless we skip a week as we did last week. And I'm going to talk about that in a sec. Before we dive in, may I remind those of you who might be watching on Facebook to do this thing in the blue banner. You can leave comments, participate, ask questions, crack jokes. I love it. We're here live and I want this to be interactive. So if you'd like to participate and also let everyone know who you are, go to streamyard.com/Facebook and give permission to show your name. If you're watching on YouTube, no problem. You don't need to worry about that. Hello, gang. I just want to open up the comment box because I see some folks already here and saying hi. Terry Finn is here. What a delight to have you here. And Anne is here, waving hi out to you guys and to everyone else who's here. Hey, Sarah's here. Hello. Don't be shy about saying hi. This has become such a fun conversation, a two-way conversation about story structure, writing craft, and the mindset of the working writer. Here I am. I'm an author, and I am also the founder of Path of the Storyteller, which is my platform for teaching and mentoring writers. And those of you who are here, hey, Nancy's here, Molly's here. Okay, the whole gang's showing up. I love it. Those of you who are interested in Path of the Storyteller, I hope you'll get on the mailing list. It's www.pathofthestoryteller.com. Now, here's the thing. If you were on my mailing list already, which I hope you were, you got an invitation from me last week when I didn't go live to send me your questions, your thoughts, your hopes and dreams and ideas, your fears and wishes about today's topic, which is plots and subplots. Sometimes the plot thickens, my friends, but sometimes it thins. Sometimes our plot has like a little plot next to it, like a sidecar, like a horse and a pony, right? It's just a different question of scale. Sometimes our main plot is just traveling with some buddies, some little plots to keep it company. So that's what we mean by plots and subplots. I'm going to go into this in depth today, but I want to thank everyone on my mailing list who sent me an email sharing your questions, your anxieties, your neuroses about this. Oh, waving hi to Erin too. Glad you're here, Erin. I just want to give you a little taste of what we're going to talk about today, because those of you that sent me questions, they were amazing. I'm just going to look at a few of them now, not to answer them, but to kind of help whet your appetite for the conversation that's about to happen. Nancy sent some great questions. A lot of them had to do with structure. How does the subplot relate to the story structure? And particularly, she asks, the concept of the hero's journey, which anyone who watches this channel or is one of my Path of the Storyteller students knows that I love to use the mythic archetypes of the hero's journey story structure as a way to deepen not only our understanding. I was about to say our understanding. Yes, we deepen our understanding of story structure, but we also deepen our own ability to craft stories that work. It's a practical tool. It's not just a technique of literary analysis. This is something for writers. We're here for the writers. So that's a great question, Nancy. She also asked, does it run parallel to the main plot? Like an echo. Wonderful image there. Yeah, is it just like another lane on the plot superhighway? Or alternatively, does it intersect with the hero's journey to enrich it somehow? Does it involve other characters? Does it have to involve other characters who are then the mini heroes of their own stories? Such great questions, Nancy. And she also asks, and this is really, really thoughtful, does the subplot help heal the hero's wound? I'm going to talk about what she means by that in a minute, because that's like a real good story structure question. Like, what is story structure for anyway? And helping heal the hero's wound is certainly part of it. Anne also sent some great questions. Now, Anne's questions tended to gravitate toward an inquiry about why we might use subplots. Are they necessary? Is there a reason that we should use them? Do we have to use them? The why is super important. So I'm very grateful to Anne for foregrounding this type of inquiry. She asks, is it perhaps to create a more multidimensional landscape for the world of the story and for the characters to inhabit? Is it? That's a really great idea. And it also is possible and proposes that it might be a tool for helping the reader see the world in a more communal or empathetic way. This is such good thinking. Does the interweaving of multiple storylines have an impact on the way the reader sees the world of the story? Super good thinking. Now, Cynthia also sent me a great note, and I'm grateful to you, Cynthia, because it was just honest. And she says that she has felt at times that about her own work that there's just too much going on, or conversely, there's not enough happening. It's just hard to know which is the truth. So relatable, Cynthia. Thank you. Clearly, we need to sort this out. I'm going to try to help you out today. And I want to send a special hug and thank you to Molly, who's here. Hey, Molly, I'm so glad you asked this question, or actually sent the email in response to my question, where you basically just confessed, I have shelved a novel that is basically a heap of amusing subplots. Now, listen, a heap of amusing subplots is not the worst thing in the world. Like that sounds very promising. But I do understand the frustration of writing what you intend to be a novel, only to discover that what you have is a heap of amusing subplots without a sufficient structure to really truly make it a book. Maybe it feels at that point more episodic or like a collection of short stories. It's a real problem. And yes, sometimes we put these things on the shelf, Molly, but I want to perhaps by the end of today's discussion make you feel empowered to take it off the shelf and look at it with some fresh eyes. So based on the questions that you submitted, I'm going to look at these basic principles today. What are subplots? Like structurally, what are they exactly? Which I hope will answer Nancy's questions. How do we use them and how do we layer them into our overall story? And why might we use them in our work? Why? The why that Nancy proposes that we investigate. So really, really good stuff. If you've got more questions or comments, I'm looking at the comments as we go. So just dive in. Post your thoughts and we'll try to weave them into the conversation as ever. All right, we're going to start with the what. What are they? What are subplots? Well, we all know that sub means under or subordinate. So a subplot's a smaller version of a plot. So let's first talk in very simple terms about what is a plot. Now, from a character's perspective, the plot is their journey of transformation. From the reader's perspective, the plot is the what happens, right? The what happens of it. They read a book, and if you say, tell me the plot of that book, the reader will say, this is what happened. That's the reader's experience. From the character's experience, which is what we writers create, it's actually the journey of transformation. It's what changes. So it's not just what happens, but it's what changes, how the character changes over the course of the narrative. Now, from the writer's perspective, how do we make this happen? It was asked, how does this relate to the hero's journey? The hero's journey is a really, really wonderful and sort of nuanced unpacking of how transformation happens. And that's not something I'm going to try to teach in this live stream because it's a lot of material. So I'm going to do a sort of a basic version, which I think will be just helpful because it's easier to remember, right? And as a post-it note version, I guess, of story structure. So a plot essentially is a journey of change that has three parts. It's a beginning, middle, and end. All right. We often call these acts, and you might hear people call it 3-act structure, but it's just all different ways of saying beginning, middle, and end. But this beginning, middle, and end is depicting a journey of change or transformation. So the beginning is where the need for transformation is established. So we've got a main character who's in a position that's not sustainable. Either they've got some growing and learning to do, or the world that they're in is afflicted in some way, their needs aren't being met. It can't last. It's a world that they can't go on like this, whether they realize it or not. They can't go on like this. So in the beginning, we establish that truth. We establish the specificity of what this problem is, and the mission or adventure that the hero is going to go on to affect this transformation is established. A lot happens in the beginning of a story. The middle is basically, it's most of the story. It's all the trials and revelations that the hero is going to go on in the pursuit of this mission over the course of this adventure. And these trials and revelations are what create the pressure on the hero, what challenges the hero, pushes them out of their comfort zone again and again and again, thus resulting in change and growth. That's where it happens. It is, as we say at Path of the Storyteller, the pasta machine of story. The crank is turned not once, but again and again. Pressure is applied to the hero, and they go in one way, and they come out beautiful fettuccine. Can you tell I'm a little bit hungry today? That's the middle. And what's the end of a story, or the third act? Well, this is where the true meaning of this transformation is revealed. What the hero has accomplished in the second act has led them to a kind of a deepened, fresh version of the original challenge. The hero's wound, as Nancy mentioned in her email, is kind of exposed and dealt with finally. And because of all of this change, transformation, whatever you want to call it, not only is the hero coming out of the story a different person than they went in, but it tends to ripple outward. Their new state of being casts a little glow on the world of the story. So it's typically impacted in ways that are manifested outside the direct personal experience of the hero. Maybe because of what the hero's done, there's a whole family that's in a different situation, or a whole town, community, a nation, a planet. You know, you've all read stories where you can see that the end depicts a world of change. Everything has changed. Peace has been restored, or, you know, there's all kinds of ways to think about it. But that's beginning, middle, and end. Now, I said I was going to be quick about it and try to be simple, and maybe that felt a little less than simple. So I'm going to even bring it down into fewer words. Plot is beginning, middle, and end. The beginning is the identification of the problem. The middle is the struggle of trying to solve it. And the end is the resolution of the struggle. All right. So what we have in a sense is problem, struggle, and resolution. That's as simple as I can make it. If you've got a Post-it note near you, this is the place to write it down. Problem, struggle, resolution. First act, second act, third act. Beginning, middle, end. All right, that's plot. Now, the reason that it's useful to be simple about it is that now we're going to talk about multiple plots. And it's hard to imagine, it's hard to visualize or conceive of layering multiple complex systems on top of each other, right? And that's why people get frightened when they're talking about plots and subplots. So for our purposes today, we're just going to think of problem, struggle, resolution. And we're going to use that as our working definition, because a subplot is simply a simpler plot. It's just a smaller version of the full-blown plot. But what makes it a subplot as opposed to an incident, an event, a little, you know, foray into some other character's experience, is that it has this three-part shape. It has a problem, it has a struggle, and it has a resolution. So anything that has that shape can be considered a plot. And if it's not the main plot of your story, guess what? It's a subplot. Now, I want to give a shout out to one of our occasional mentors here at the Path of the Storyteller community, Ernest Hemingway, who famously, I think there's a story about it, I don't know if it's true, or one of these, you know, Hemingway legends, but somebody made him a bet that he couldn't write a complete story in 6 words. And Hemingway did, and he famously wrote this story: For sale, baby shoes, never worn. Now, that's 6 words. Does it have a problem? Is there a struggle? Is there a resolution? Yes, there are. He won that bet. By any measure, that is a complete story. And it is, not only is it a complete story, but it's one that packs an emotional punch. So it's possible to write a subplot that is really compressed. The scale of the subplot is totally up to the writer and the needs of the work, but it is not an equivalent structure to the main plot. It could be 6 words. Now, chances are in a novel, our subplots are not going to be 6 words, but they might be quite brief. The question is often raised, can there be more than one subplot? Well, according to this definition, yes. Anything that you give a 3-act structure to in your book is worthy of the name subplot. So you could have many, but the question of scale is up to you. You can scale them up to be subplots that last for much of the book, or you can have a subplot that is introduced and resolved in a single chapter and we never hear from again, right? So you have a lot of power, I guess is the best word. You have total power over the way you think of the subplots in your book. But the difference between the subplot and the main plot is basically twofold. It's scale, it's the size of it, and more importantly, it's hierarchy. So hierarchy is just my way of saying the main plot is by far the most important. It is the structure of your book. The main plot is the one in which your main character, the hero, is going to go on this big, nuanced journey of transformation of consciousness, as Joseph Campbell would say. It is an enduring change. It is a meaningful change. It is one that's going to have an impact on the world of the story. They're going to go through a lot to get from where they are at the beginning of the story to where they are at the end. Chances are the point of view that you choose to do the storytelling is going to be locked in some way to the main character of your main plot. So it's really important to just remember that this is what's holding up your book. This is your book. It has a beginning, middle, and end. And if we talk about the second act of your story, we're talking about the second act of the main plot. Even though, as I've just tried to describe, you could nest within the hierarchy of plots of your book lots of structures, lots of 3-part structures that have beginnings, middles, and ends, but their rhythm is not what is dictating the rhythm of the work as a whole. That is the job of the main plot. So that's what I mean by hierarchy. The subplot is both shorter, but it's also not running the show. It is subordinate in every way to the main plot. Now, how do we make it subordinate? Well, it's interesting because we can decide to organize our subplots according to character, as was suggested. And one of the things that we can do with subplots is to create subplots that also star the hero of our main plot. So that's one approach. We can have the hero of our main plot going on a primary mission of transformation, and they've got this thing that they've got to do in the second act, and that's the book is organized according to that principle. But we can also give that character something that is a subplot. Now, there's I'm going to pull up some examples, right? Let's see. Well, for example, any plot that has a like a love story kind of attached to the main story, you can look at it as there's this character on a big journey of transformation, and then there's also a love story. I'm thinking of books like, for example, The Hunger Games. The main story clearly is Katniss going to the Hunger Games, surviving, saving her family, and ultimately having a big heroic impact on the larger world. But then there's the subplot of like which of the boys that she likes is the one she's going to end up with. One is what organizes the book, but the other is also really fun and really appealing to the reader. So that's an example of a plot and a subplot working together where the hero is the hero of both of those plots. Okay, so that's one example. Another example that is a great favorite of mine, of course, is Charlotte's Web. Now, the main plot of Charlotte's Web is about a pig named Wilbur whose life needs to be saved. He's born on a farm, and his destiny is to be slaughtered for bacon when he's old enough. He's a spring pig, and so he's going to make it till Christmas, and that's it. Then he's going to end up, on the dining room table. So that's the main plot of Charlotte's Web. And Wilbur is clearly the hero. It's Wilbur's life that's at stake, and he's the one ultimately who's got to do what it takes to, to save himself. But the way that book is structured is wonderfully sophisticated and also very clear, because when we start the book, there's a character named Fern who's a little girl on the farm, and she's actually the first character that we meet. So this is a very unusual type structure in that the first hero that we meet is not the hero of the main plot of the book, but the hero of the main plot of the book is the focal point of Fern's subplot. So we meet Fern as she decides to save the life of this runt pig who's just been born. And so she's the hero of this little subplot of Fern saving the runt pig. And as soon as Wilbur's old enough, she's the one that names him Wilbur and dresses him up in dog clothes and pushes him around in the carriage. But then he's old enough and he takes over. He kind of grows into being the hero of the main plot of the book. And then later on in the book, we meet this character, Charlotte, who's this incredible spider who befriends Wilbur. And then she herself goes on quite a journey of transformation where she makes a decision to redeem herself. She lives a rather bloodthirsty life, just trapping creatures in her web and sucking their blood. Like, she knows that her life kind of lacks a certain grandeur. It's kind of rough and tumble. She's well aware of it. And she decides to redeem herself in a way, to strive for something more generous and more enlightened by making some tremendously heroic efforts to save Wilbur's life. She befriends him and she says, no, I'm going to do what it takes to save you. She gives her life in the process, and that's it. But the Charlotte plot is incredible. It's a subplot of such depth and feeling that we almost could say, well, isn't Charlotte like a secondary hero? But I just ask you to look at the structure of this book. It's got this great plot with Fern that kicks us off, but it's about saving Wilbur's life. Later on, Fern's subplot gets woven throughout, and it's about Fern growing up, losing interest in hanging out with farm animals and shifting her interest to being more toward boys and, growing up. It's a wonderful a theme, an elaboration of the overall theme of life and mortality that the book is about. So Fern has this really wonderful subplot, but it starts out being about Wilbur. And Wilbur sort of carries the main plot throughout the book. And then Charlotte has this substantial and moving subplot, but it's also about saving Wilbur. So this is, to me, a brilliant example of layering subplots that all kind of have to do with the hero of the main story. There's no Fern plot of saving the runt pig without Wilbur, and there's no Charlotte plot of saving Wilbur without Wilbur, right? So this is a great example, very efficient storytelling. So that's one. There's another more simple example that I think of sometimes, which is A Wrinkle in Time, a book that was a favorite of mine as a kid. You've got a main hero, Meg Murray, and she has a very simple plot, super simple. Her father's been abducted and is being held captive by this evil force on the other side of the universe. And the invitation to adventure comes to Meg to go save him. Meg's got to save her dad. Super simple. That's the plot. Everything that she does in the book is in order to save her dad. But there's a boy, right? There's this boy Calvin that she likes. And so he ends up being part of the adventure. He becomes one of the co-travelers on her adventure to save dad. So it's very easy to think of this as the main plot is Meg saving her dad, but there's this romance subplot of what's going to happen with her and Calvin. But because he's helping her save dad, they kind of do travel together. So that's an example of the way those plots can work together. So I hope everybody's keeping up now. Hey, Hillary, glad you're here. Glad you're here. All right. So they can intertwine if the hero is kind of involved in both of them. If the main characters of the subplot are part of the hero's overall mission, if they're like a fellow traveler. And there is also a kind of subplot in which the hero really has nothing to do with it. And so, I mean, broadly speaking, these are two different types of subplots. Like the type that the hero is basically involved in, but it's just exploring a different facet. And the one that the hero has very little to do with. This, to me, is a more like traditionally theatrical subplot. You'll see this type of plotting on television shows because television structure borrows a lot from theater, where there's really like an A plot and a B plot. You can find this easily in Shakespeare plays where there's a dramatic plot. We have scenes of drama based on a certain set of characters, either trying to win a war or save a kingdom or, deal with a doomed romance or whatever it is the main characters are doing. And then we cut to the comic characters and they've got a whole other story going on. They're putting on a show. They're, having their heads turned into donkey heads. Like they've got a whole separate story going on. This kind of subplot can also work in fiction, but just know that it's trickier to do. It's trickier to do. And if you have a book that has a large scope of storytelling, if it's epic in scale, if you are writing a series, you brave person, you may find that you've got independent plot threads to deal with. And then you may have to make decisions about how to toggle back and forth between your A plot and your B plot, or your C plot or your D plot. If you've really lost your mind and you're writing something like Game of Thrones, you've probably run out of letters of the alphabet because there's so many characters and each one of them has an independent plot. And yes, there's this vague idea that there's a struggle for the throne and there's zombies coming from the north that everybody has to contend with, but it's just so overwhelmingly complicated that we all know that even the very skilled and experienced author of that series is having a hard time bringing it to the finish line. So I don't recommend overcomplicating things. Now, the main thing that I want you to remember is that all of these plots, whether they're including the hero or separate from the hero, have this shape: beginning, middle, and end. Some problem is identified. There's a struggle to solve it, and it comes to some resolution. All right. Now, the way this impacts point of view is something I want to touch on before moving away from it, because if you are envisioning a story that has subplots where your hero is not involved directly all the way through, you really have to think about the point of view. Because if you try to write a story like that in, say, first person, you're going to get stuck quickly. And what writers will sometimes do is begin writing in first person. They want to introduce a subplot and they didn't think it through, right? And instead of saying, whoops, I would like to write the type of story in which I can weave together multiple subplots, including those in which my primary hero has nothing to do with, I need to write it in third person. Oops, like they don't actually want to go back and face the fact that they made the wrong choice. And so they'll want to continue writing in first person. And so they'll just keep switching viewpoint character. I'm not yelling at anyone. If you're out there saying, why are you calling me out, Mary Rose? I'm not thinking of anyone in particular. This is not aimed at anyone. but I just see it happen, that this making a decision about what point of view to write in becomes really fraught if you start working with subplots and you've chosen a point of view that's not going to easily accommodate it. We talked about the Hunger Games, which is written in the first person, and the plot and the primary subplot both are very personal to the hero, Katniss, who's also the narrator. We can hear about her survival in the Hunger Games, and we can also hear about how she feels about these two boys that are vying for her affections. It's fine. It's all Katniss. It only gets to be problematic in that work. Later on, book 2, book 3, the scale of the story gets quite large. Now there's a war on. There's a lot of stuff happening, and no longer can our hero be everywhere at once in order to narrate it. So you'll see that it becomes a little problematic. If you're a fan of that series, feel free to argue with me in the comments. But in terms of the first book, the one that launched the trilogy, it's very clear that we're just with Katniss, and she's got this plot and this subplot, and it's fantastic. Her perspective is more than enough. Charlotte's Web, a book, by the way, that any third grader can read with perfect satisfaction, actually uses a far more sophisticated structure because it's in an omniscient third person that can move very freely between these subplots that are essential and weave them seamlessly into the main story of saving Wilbur's life. So there's no I'll bow down to E.B. White. That's all I can say. It's a sort of a masterclass in writing in an omniscient third person in a way that is crystal clear, super well organized. So point of view is definitely something I want you to consider when you're in your head thinking, okay, where are the subplots? Now, this question of where is like the big question, right? So we've got these subplots. Some of them are bigger, some of them are smaller. We understand the hierarchy, right? That the main plot is number one always, that the main hero is the one who's basically driving the bus, as we say, a path of the storyteller through the whole book. But I've got these other subplots that I want to work in. Some are big, some are medium sized. Where do I put them? How do I get them started? Where do I end them? All right, so this is the tricky bit. Now, I will give you a very blunt piece of advice, even though I already gave you an example of E.B. White doing it a different way. You pretty much can't go wrong by making sure you start and end the book with your main plot. All right, particularly starting the book, because it's a little tricky to start with a subplot, introduce your reader to a character that they're assuming like, okay, this is the main character. This is the one I'm going to identify with. I'm going to go along for the ride. And then 2 chapters in, it turns out that was just a subplot and you're pivoting now to the real main character. The reader doesn't like that kind of shift. It's disruptive and confusing. Did E.B. White do it differently? Yes, he did. But he's E.B. White, and also the first words out of Fern's mouth are about Wilbur, and she's basically it's all about Wilbur, so it really works well. It's kind of the exception that proves the rule. Take a look at it if you want to see what I mean. It's really worth studying how he does it. So that's just a basic piece of advice. Now, as for the rest of the subplots, depending on what they're going to be, you can look at the structure of your main hero's journey and just figure out where the logical place for them to kick off is. As we often do, I'm going to look at the Wizard of Oz film structure because it's so clear. You can look at Dorothy, clearly the main character of this narrative. The main plot of The Wizard of Oz is getting Dorothy Gale home to Kansas. That's what it's about from beginning to end. We begin in Kansas, we meet Dorothy, we learn what's not so great about her home life. Guess what? She gets whisked off into the second act of adventure, and she's going to try to get home again. And the third act is how she gets home and what happens when she gets there. It's problem, struggle, resolution. But look what happens when she gets into the second act. She meets other characters. First, she meets a scarecrow, and then she meets a tin man, and then she meets a cowardly lion. Now, think about this for a minute. Each of those characters has a problem, a struggle, and a resolution. So why I'm using it as an example, because it's just so clean and easy to see, right? The scarecrow has a problem. He's a scarecrow. He doesn't have a brain. He wants a brain. All right. This is his problem. Tin Man wants a heart. Cowardly Lion needs courage. Each of those characters is introduced to us with a problem. And the struggle that they decide to share is to become Dorothy's co-adventurers. And they all share the struggle of getting to see the wizard to ask him for help. So her co-travelers, the co-adventurers of the hero's main plot in The Wizard of Oz, arrive as full protagonists of their own subplots. But they don't arrive in the same scene, do they? First, she meets the Scarecrow, kicks that subplot off. Then she meets the Tin Man, adds that to the mix, and then we get to the Cowardly Lion and we add that to the mix. So each of those subplots, has its own like unveiling. And this is really important because the storytelling is so pristine and compressed that each of them truly has a full 3-act structure. Now, if you follow the events of that tale to the very end, so there's the struggle and they share in the struggle, and then they get to the resolution. You probably remember, if you remember the film, that all 3 of those subplots are resolved in the same scene, even though they were all introduced separately. And the struggle kind of piggybacks on top of the struggle of the main story. They all get resolved in the same scene when the wizard says, well, I'm going to give you a diploma and I'm going to give you a clock and I'm going to give you all this stuff. So he solves the problems of each of these characters in the same scene. But Dorothy's problem is not solved yet. So because she's the main character and hers is the main plot, her plot has to have its own resolution. That's what comes next. The wizard can't help her. She has her own scene with Glinda, and she gets to go home to Kansas and fade out. Now it's resolved. So I'm explaining this, and I hope it's familiar to most of you, because I think you can see just the simple kind of architecture of how you can have a main plot that begins, gets your hero into the second act. You kick off a subplot that has a secondary character, kind of the star of it. And what makes it a subplot? Because it's got those 3 parts. It's got that problem, struggle, resolution. Kick off subplot number 1. Great. Now those 2 plots are kind of riding together through the struggle part. Kick off subplot number 2, new character with new problem, right? So the first 2 characters we met are in their second act. The new character, we have to meet them in their first act because we have to establish their problem. Then they get into the second act. We've got 3 characters in the second act together. And then we add the third subplot. Now we've got our hero plus her 3 subplot friends all having the same struggle. They get to the third act for resolution. The subplots are dealt with very swiftly and all together. And then the main hero is made, because of hierarchy, is given her own resolution. I'm just going to stop for a minute. Does anybody have trouble understanding that or has any further questions about it? I absolutely would love to hear. So this is just a simple example of what we all do, right? When we weave subplots in and out. You don't have to make your subplots piggyback onto the main character's plot, but you can, just like Meg Murray's romance subplot with Calvin piggybacks onto Saving Father because he wants to help her do it. He's a co-adventurer on her main plot. But this isn't necessarily the case. I think of the notable chapter in The Hobbit, for example. Bilbo's got this big adventure and he's got co-adventurers, and some of them have their own plots, right? I would argue that the character of Thorin, his subplot, he's got a full character arc himself. But there's a chapter in which Bilbo is separated from his group and he encounters a creature called Gollum. And in this one chapter, there is an entire subplot of Bilbo versus Gollum, and it has a beginning. I'm trapped in a cave with this monstrous creature and it has a struggle. Well, if I can beat him in a game of riddles, I'll be able to get out of here. And then it has a resolution, right? And he's able to get out. So the Gollum chapter it has a very complete story structure, and Gollum is such a vivid character that we can sort of almost look at that as like a plot it rises up almost out of the fabric of the main story, even though it's definitely part of Bilbo's main story, but it has this kind of quality. And this is such a great comment. I'm going to bring this up here. Anne says, sounds like we're wanting to learn how to write a novel versus an unintentional soap opera. Exactly. I love this comment, because an unintentional soap opera, what that means to me, Anne, and you can post a follow-up comment if you meant something else by it. A soap opera lacks this kind of structure, right? It doesn't ever resolve. It's just incident after incident. It's just like emotional fireworks after emotional fireworks. It doesn't have structure in this way, right? It's just all this undulating feeling. And this is, soap operas are designed not to resolve because they go on and on and on and on. And they have fans, and, there's people who love that kind of storytelling. But we want to write novels. And so we definitely want to rely upon this rhythm, this 3-part rhythm. Now, speaking of rhythm, I want to, and I see Terry's got a question about backstory. Let me circle back to that in a minute, Terry. It's a good question. But speaking of rhythm, I want to now, so we've talked about what a plot is, right? Problem, struggle, resolution. We've noted that a subplot can be really short or, last largely the length of the book or any place in between. And that we can layer them in as the story, as the main story demands, that is really what's controlling the structure of the book as a whole. And that we can start them wherever they most logically start. We can continue them for as long as they should logically continue. We can resolve them independently. They are not all starting at the same time and resolving at the same time. Like, it's not a free-for-all of plots. All right. Now, why do we use them? I want to move to Anne's kind of insightful questions about this. So one of the things that I always think of is like music composition. And I was raised studying music, and so I often go back to that as a source of imagery to think about structure. So if you're musically trained at all, you know these words, but if you don't, they're easy to explain. So there's a main melody, right? There's the tune of something, and then often there's harmony. So they're kind of different notes, but they go with the melody. They're meant to complement the melody, to add feeling to it. If the harmony is like in a major key, it's cheerful and majestic, or might have a military feeling. Like, we can create a lot of emotions through harmony. If it's in a minor key, it's like sad and gloomy and thoughtful or romantic. We can create a lot of emotion depending on what kind of harmony we put to a melody. The same melody with different harmony will have a totally different feeling. And then there's also the idea of counterpoint, which essentially is a different melody that's designed to kind of play off of the major melody. Now, I find this a very useful set of images to answer the question of why we use subplots. If we so choose, we don't have to, but if we so choose, we can think of subplots as the harmony to the melody of our main plot. By adding different types of subplots to it, we can emphasize or point out different emotional notes, create different feelings, just reveal different facets of it. And so these are subplots that are kind of designed, kind of to be thematically related to it. They add a kind of a useful complexity, right? And a complexity that expands and just shows us different facets of the meaning and the feelings that are raised by the main plot. Now, So yeah, exploring the central theme in a useful variety of ways is what I wrote in my notes. That's a kind of a good way to say it. So by adding subplots that add harmony to the melody of the main plot, we're just exploring it in a useful variety of ways. Now, if we add subplots that are in counterpoint to the main plot, so they are in a sense competing with it, they're not necessarily following it, they're maybe mirroring it or reversing it somehow, or showing a similar situation that plays out completely differently. What we can do with that is we can create irony, right? We actually can speak to the reader in a sense and say, oh, look how this story is playing out for these characters, but look how it's playing out very differently. Something similar but different is happening to these characters. It adds a kind of a pointedness, a counter narrative. It invites the reader to consider ambiguity, different possibilities. And this goes back to Anne's very good question that she emailed me about, is it a reason to use subplots to create an invitation to the reader to think about this world in a broader, maybe more empathetic way, to expand their understanding of the story that we're trying to tell? And the answer is a big yes, Anne. That's definitely what I mean when I say the use of subplot as counterpoint to shed light on all the ways in which the main narrative might not be the only possible story. Now, one of the things that we talk about in the hero's journey, deep exploration of story structure, is that our hero is always going to have two big things to resolve. There's going to be something external to resolve in the world of the story, and there's also going to be something internal to resolve. And it's an interesting, we call it the inside dragon and the outside dragon. This is another Joseph Campbell reference. Joseph Campbell said, in a myth, the hero has to sometimes literally slay a dragon, has to do some brave deed in the world, has to deal with something in the outside world. But it's the inside dragon is the one that matters. Who do they need to become in order to do the thing in the world, right? You don't just go from, I'm sitting at home, not a hero at the beginning of a tale, plunged into a difficult adventure and able to do everything that's offered to you. That's not a very good story. The story has to draw the hero into a different consciousness, a different way of being. And so the inside transformation of who does the hero have to become in order to do the difficult thing that has been set for them? We look at these as almost two threads, the inside dragon and the outside dragon. So another way, without muddying this too much for you, to think of why we would use subplots is to make sure that both the outside story and the inside story of the hero are fully developed. If we've got a hero who's got to learn to be a great fighter, like Katniss in the Hunger Games, can we also give her a subplot that makes her softer and gentler and more loving and more vulnerable? Like the becoming a great fighter and all of that is one thing, but falling in love is something else. And you see that it's a fuller development for her. It gives her a more well-rounded development. So that's another reason that we might use them. So we're going to add useful complexity. We might add some irony. We're going to explore the central theme in a variety of ways by adding these subplots. And also we're going to deepen the hero's experience in their main plot. These subplots are indeed going to help perhaps heal the hero's wound, and just shed all kinds of new light on what this story is really fundamentally about. Now, I want to go back, let's see, to Terry's comment. Subplots can double as backstory, which feed characterizations, no? Then the subplots come together and complete character arcs in the story. Well, I would say, Terry, that a subplot, I'm not sure what you mean by doubling as backstory. So backstory, of course, is the history of the characters or the world of the tale. For those of you that might be wondering what Terry means by backstory, it's often reveals motivations. It often reveals the psychology of characters in a way that helps us understand why they might be wounded. there are whole novels. I'm thinking of A Christmas Carol by Dickens, in which basically we meet a character who's in dire need of spiritual transformation. And he, along with us, is invited to examine his own backstory. He's just given that opportunity. There's a supernatural assist. It's a Wonderful Life, a great Christmas film, basically follows the exact same structure. As our hero is invited to, examine the backstory, they are able to go on a journey of transformation as a result of what they have to face about their own lives. So but those are the main plots of those stories. Now, in a plot that doesn't have that kind of a main plot that doesn't have that kind of structure, if there is a subplot that involves a character who's part of the hero's backstory. So let's say, I'm going to put this down. Let's say that you've got a plot. The main plot involves a character who's got various kinds of wounds and things that needs to be healed, and you invent a subplot where someone from their past, or a parent or a family member, someone who has access to their backstory, right, becomes their fellow traveler, like the Scarecrow and Dorothy, or becomes a force that they encounter perhaps only briefly in the second act, like, for example, Bilbo and Gollum, the kind of subplot that just happens and is wrapped up, but the hero is changed by it and gets to move on from it. And the reader is let in on the backstory at the same time that the hero has to deal with it. You see that the flexibility of this allows you to invent subplots that will do that for you. If you need that in your storytelling, you can come up with a subplot where somebody from the past who knows about the past can show up and have a subplot. And that's the kind of subplot that would really help the hero with their inner journey, with the thing they've got to accomplish on the inside. As long as it's got that structure, that, beginning, middle, and end, it's a subplot. Now, if you don't want to go full subplot, you can also have powerful encounters between your hero and a secondary character. We call those archetypal encounters. Sometimes someone shows up and it's a mentor figure, or it's a trickster figure, or, they're doing various things to provoke the hero's growth. Those kinds of encounters don't rise to the level of subplot, right? That's one of the things I want to be clear about. When we're talking about subplots, we're weaving in an arc, what sometimes people call a character arc, that 3-part structure of development is problem, struggle, and resolution. Fantastic. Now, speaking of secondary characters, I want to now give you just a couple of caveats before we wrap up today. As you can see, the secondary characters really are quite important when we talk about subplots. Your hero might have a plot and a subplot that doesn't involve anybody else, but I think that'd be pretty rare storytelling. The secondary cast is not there just for you to have fun making subplots, right? It's not that every character you introduce to your narrative deserves a full arc. They might not. They might be there just to provoke the hero on their journey. They might be an archetypal energy that's provoking the hero on their journey. Okay? Think about really what you are trying to accomplish. It's not everything needs a whole subplot. Now, and Molly's here still, I hope, right? So this is what can happen, is we just become very enamored of our cast of characters. I know you love your characters. I know you love them all. You think of them and they spring to life in your mind, but you need to have discipline about whether the secondary cast of characters that you're so enamored with are just that. They are there to provide obstacles or assistance or mentorship or just necessary difficulty and complexity to your hero on the hero's main plot. If they're going to become a fellow traveler, if they're going to be along for the ride for a length of time, if there's something about their potential 3-part structure, their little arc of change that amplifies the theme of the book, that sheds a new light, that provides a counter narrative, that deepens the reader's experience, right, then maybe you're in subplot territory. But a subplot is not a given. Just because you introduce a character does not mean they need a whole subplot. Okay. Now, and here's the last caveat. All right. When we start to get subplot happy, when we start to get excited and we start to let everything that comes into the imaginative world of our story demand its own plot, like, oh, that could be a book and that could be a book and they could be a story. We start to think, well, I've got to develop all this material. Sometimes what we're doing is we're failing to fully develop the main plot. We know something's missing. We just know it's not enough. And we may not be sure of how to really fully develop one plot with one protagonist over the course of a novel length of work. We just may not really know how to do it, or we just may be skittish about trying to do it. We can't imagine that one character with one problem and one sustained struggle and one resolution is enough to fill a book. And so we automatically grab at ideas that come to us. We're so grateful for them. We're like, oh, good. Now I can fill a book. I've got 20 ideas. That should be enough. One hero with one mission, one journey of transformation is more than enough to fill a book. And I just ask you to think for a minute as a reader about the books you love most. And I guarantee you that most of them are going to be about one unforgettable character who goes on some amazing journey of meaningful transformation and is changed at the end, and the world around them is changed as well. It's enough. When we don't realize it's enough or we don't believe it's enough, it's because we haven't taken the time to go deep enough. We don't have a full enough understanding of just how incremental a journey of transformation of that scope needs to be. A lot needs to happen to get Bilbo Baggins from his little hobbit hole at the beginning of The Hobbit to who he is at the end when he returns to that same hobbit hole and he's a totally different guy. So much has happened in between. So we have to be aligned with our own resistance to trusting that we can fully develop the journey of one unforgettable character is more than enough. Now, once you are doing that, subplots add to the fun, but they cannot cover up a lack of development in the main plot. All right? That's my word of wisdom. Oh, Molly says, oops. Well, Molly, now you know what to do instead, right? Maybe you'll take that book off the shelf. I'm going to just quickly go back. If you've got questions before we sign off, throw them in the chat box now. I want to very quickly go back in my notes to the great questions that you submitted and make sure we kind of covered them all. I think we've got the structure questions down, including these great questions from Nancy about whether the subplot has to run parallel to the main plot or intersect with it. As you see, Nancy, it can go either way. But what's important is that it doesn't have to run parallel to it the whole way through. It can run parallel with it for a little while and then go and then resolve. Anne's great questions about why we might use them. Yes, Anne, you're totally right. We're creating a greater sense of dimension in the world of the story and in the characters. And we can also help the reader see the world of the story from different vantage points, and maybe even to, start to develop their own opinion about whether what the hero's doing is the right thing. We can introduce complexity and irony by intentional use of subplots. Cynthia is wondering about too much going on versus nothing's happening. Any well-told story, even a 6-word story, as Hemingway offered, has so much happening. So much is happening, right? And so as long as your hero has a problem and struggles and there's a resolution, that's a lot. A lot is happening. You just have to commit to that. When nothing's happening, Cynthia, to me, that is often the result of a hero who either doesn't have a clearly defined problem or who has a problem but refuses to struggle with it, is passive, is just sitting with their problem, watching the other characters be busy. So always think about whether your hero has a problem and whether they're actively trying to solve it, whether they're in the struggle. If they're doing that, believe me, plenty is happening. If there's too much going on, look at the idea of hierarchy. Make sure your hero story is so well developed that there's no question that that's what we're here for, and make sure that your subplots are in an appropriate scale and hierarchy relative to the main plot. Molly, we just dealt with your happy problem, your surfeit of creativity, right? What a happy problem for a writer to have. I love it. All right, terrific. We'll wrap up with Anne's comment. Thank you, Anne. I'm glad you like these examples. Subplots are used in different novels in different ways. It's really true. And I like to mix up, a work of classic literature, a contemporary YA novel, a Hollywood movie. I actually really a middle grade classic. I just always want to remind anyone who might wonder about this, that all of the principles of storytelling are kind of broadly applicable. It isn't like there's a set of story structure rules for YA or for adult literary fiction or for Hollywood blockbusters or for picture books. Like, it's literally all the same. It's just this. It's problem, struggle, resolution. And we can ground ourselves in that understanding, and then we can start to see clearly what holds stories together, both in all the works that we encounter in our day, which there are plentiful, but also in our own work. Let it be simple. If you feel overwhelmed, let it be simple and see if that makes you feel a little more empowered to dive in and solve some of the issues in your own writing. All right, my friends, thank you for this wonderful time together. I hope this was of benefit. If you're watching on YouTube, will you do me a solid and subscribe to this channel? And if you like the content, will you give it a thumbs up? YouTube really likes it when people do that. And we want to make YouTube happy so that YouTube will let more people know about this channel, and more storytellers like you can come on in and be part of our fun gatherings every Wednesday. The more, the merrier. I so appreciate all of you. The questions you emailed me, the stuff you posted in the comments while we were live, it's all fantastic. Until the next time I see you, happy writing, and I will see you next time. So long.